Well, we've heard the debate about peak oil, whether the world has reached its maximum in producing oil. Well, now there is a new concept that's being floated about, and it's called peak carbon. A veteran environmentalist says the U.S. has reached it. Margaret Ryan's our executive editor, and she's here with more. Good morning.
Good morning, Susan. Well, this is Lester Brown, head of the Earth Policy Institute and a fixture in environmental circles since the 1970s. He's positing that the U.S. reached its peak in carbon emissions in 2007 and that it's not going to rise to that level again in the foreseeable future. Now, emissions do drop in recessions, so I asked Brown why he thinks this latest trend is permanent.
We have 2 consecutive years in which oil consumption has dropped and coal consumption has dropped. And together they have brought carbon emissions down 9% over the last 2 years. There's a tendency to look at this and say, well, this is the recession and therefore temporary. And substantially it is, but by no means all of it. We've had a number of other things happening. There have been gains in efficiency. In 2008, 102 wind farms came online with over 8,000 megawatts of generating capacity, for example. And we're looking at a number of shifts, and we're looking in addition to the things happening in the very short run, we're also looking at things in the policy pipeline.
Now, Brown cited a series of changes in that pipeline. For instance, appliance standards. He says the last administration failed to put out rules for several years tightening those standards, so the Obama administration is now working through a backlog to issue rules for stricter standards. And the new auto efficiency standards that will increase auto efficiency by 42% by 2016 and even SUV efficiency by 25%. Moreover, he says autos are now being scrapped at a higher rate than they are being replaced, and in numbers well beyond the Cash for Clunkers program. Brown says the resulting scrap steel will lower energy demand in the steel industry. And he also sees sectoral change in electricity, more natural gas being substituted for coal and more wind capacity coming up behind, both of them lowering the sector's carbon emissions. Now, Brown says these changes aren't anticipated in government forecasts, and he sees them making a difference that will be substantial and maybe even surprising.
But I have a feeling that in this country we are moving toward some sort of a tipping point on climate and energy. And it could lead to a very rapid change. I mean, I think of the Berlin Wall coming down. You know, Eastern Europe had reached a tipping point, and that was the visual manifestation of it. And tipping points are by nature difficult to define and to anticipate. But once you reach them, change comes rapidly and often unexpectedly.
And Susan, one illustration of how fast things are moving, Brown just published his Plan B, Mobilizing to Save Civilization version 4.0. And this peak carbon prediction is already an update of this book. And one other prediction from Brown, he says, to stop the Greenland ice sheet from melting, the U.S. has to cut back its carbon usage 80% by 2020. Current legislation would do that by 2050. But he insists it's doable with a crash renewables program.
Doable, but it probably won't be done.
I think he insists that if President Obama were to do what President Roosevelt did and say, put us on essentially a wartime footing, say, this has to be done, we have to get this number of turbines out there and so on, American industry could in fact rise to the challenge.
Okay, some interesting insight there from Lester Brown. Thanks, Margaret.